3 months later, they proudly announced that of 193 patients presenting themselves, they had turned away over 41 who were pretending mental illness and considered another 42 suspect. The problem was, Dr. Rosenhana hadn't sent in a single person. 70 years later, Emil Kreplin's conclusion that psychiatry could not distinguish sanity from insanity had once again been proven correct. In his study, Rosenhana concluded, any diagnostic process that lends itself too readily to massive errors of this sort cannot be a very reliable one. It wasn't just the embarrassment of the Rosenhana experiment that caused psychiatry's leadership to take a new approach to diagnosis. With the rapid expansion in the psychotropic drug business, psychiatry underwent a seismic shift in the way it promoted mental illness. And the third edition of the DSM, spearheaded by psychiatrist Dr. Robert Spitzer, took a decidedly brain-based biological approach. Unlike its predecessors, the proposed DSM-3 assumed that mental problems derived from physical abnormalities of the brain. And instead of describing possible psychological causes for mental distress, DSM-3 would simply provide clinicians with checklists of symptoms. However, these descriptions were broad enough to apply to anyone at any time of life. With no science to back them up, these newly proposed disorders and the checklists that went with them were subject to intense negotiation, compromise, alteration, and heated debate. Psychiatrist David Schaffer, who attended the DSM-3 conference, observed,
people would shout out their opinions from all sides of the room, and whoever shouted loudest tended to be heard. My own impression, is coming straight from England, was it was more like a tobacco auction than a sort of conference.
Many committees are established to determine what should and shouldn't go into the DSM, the current revision. And a lot of the committee activity is based upon, could be personal bias, political pressure, the trend that may be in vogue then, and other things that are non-medical.
Well, in the DSM, I mean, they vote in diseases. I mean, they get together, the panel of psychiatrists look and decide, is this a disease or is this not a disease?
How many of you agree this should be a disease? They have a show of hands. They said 20 people in the room, 12 vote for it, 8 vote against it. Bingo. They have a disease. Tell me that that's science.
One psychologist reported that during discussions of the proposed criteria for masochistic personality disorder, Spitzer's wife protested about one symptom of the disorder, to which Spitzer responded, "Okay, take it out." Scientific or not, once a disorder is voted into the DSM, it is very hard to vote it out. On rare occasions, however, this too has occurred. Homosexuality, a mental illness according to DSM 1 and 2. After gay rights activists picketed their 1973 convention, the American Psychiatric Association buckled to political pressure and decided by a mail-in ballot of its member psychiatrists to remove it from DSM's next edition.
What happened? It wasn't like, there's some objective evidence that at one point it was a disease and we cured the disease and now it's a lifestyle choice. No, it was cultural. We became more liberal in this country and decided, okay, it's fine. Whereas, 50, 100 years ago, it wasn't fine, as a problem. That's not medicine. That's something else.
And the psychiatrists who wrote the DSM-3 knew it, as Robert Spitzer would admit to the BBC many years later.
What happened is that we made estimates of prevalence of mental disorders totally descriptively, without considering that many of these conditions might be normal reactions, which are not really disorders. That's the problem.
But instead of learning from their mistakes, the American Psychiatric Association published the DSM-4 in 1994. And it was even bigger. With 374 different diagnoses amongst its 886 pages, the new edition more than tripled the number of mental illnesses listed in the DSM-1. This rapid expansion in the number of psychiatric diagnoses may not help the patient, but it benefits many others. Once a diagnosis has been created, it enters the professional curricula. Specialists emerge to treat it. Conferences are organized around it. Research and publications cover it. Psychiatrists formulate their patients' symptoms to correspond to it. And drugs are prescribed for it. The DSM, in short, was no longer a manual, but a full-fledged industry.
The DSM, although it is our Bible, it becomes the Bible, and it becomes tantamount to, the tablet coming down from Mount Sinai, not just for psychiatry and psychology, but for insurance companies, for the legal profession. It comes into play as far as sentencing. It comes into play as far as custody decisions. So non-scientific information is used to make some radical, life-altering or life-ending decisions.
The danger of all these psychiatric diseases is that anyone walking the earth today could be labeled as having a mental illness. Using the DSM, psychiatrists at Harvard University have declared that half of everyone on earth will be mentally ill in their lifetime. One prominent Harvard psychiatrist, Dr. John Rady, goes a step further, arguing no one is truly normal. Though the American Psychiatric Association has quietly acknowledged the lack of evidence for Joseph Schildkraut's chemical imbalance theory, the claim is still flogged in the media and passed on to patients every day. And although you are not likely to hear it in the general media, psychiatrists readily admit that the disorders listed in the DSM have no proven pathology and therefore cannot be called medical diseases.
If you were to be confronted with someone saying that the DSM is not backed up by science, what do you have to say about that?
Oh, I would say that they're entirely right.
No, the DSM is not science.
I think there are non-scientific elements, political aspects of it that influence it. Yeah, absolutely.
DSM-4 is still far away from science.
The DSM system is far from perfect, but it's the best we have.
DSM stands for diagnosis as a source of money. It brings in a lot of money.
Nonetheless, the next edition, DSM-5, is in the planning stages and is due to be published in 2012. And this time, the negotiation for the next new psychiatric diseases is being held in secret. But we do know some of the new disorders under consideration. One is internet addiction disorder, originally presented as a joke in a 1997 New Yorker article. Regardless, it is now claimed that 25 million people may qualify as compulsive surfers. Other disorders contemplated for DSM-5 include compulsive shopping disorder, binge eating, apathy disorder, parental alienation syndrome, relational disorder, intermittent explosive disorder, road rage. All potential disease categories with psychotropic drugs waiting to be assigned to them. According to the APA, 19 of the 27 psychiatrists on the top panel deciding on what illnesses to include in the next edition of the DSM have financial ties to drug companies. The situation got so bad that the architect of DSM-3, Robert Spitzer, and DSM-4 editor Alan Francis went public, warning the APA might well be accused of a conflict of interest in fashioning DSM-5 to create new patients for psychiatrists and new customers for pharmaceutical companies. But the psychiatric community has decided not to address this issue, and for good reason. Today, psychiatric drugging rakes in over $80 billion a year for pharmaceutical companies. And with every new edition of the DSM, the diagnoses have not only expanded in number, but cast a wider net to encompass such population segments as senior citizens, the military, pregnant women, and even children.
In my training, when I first started this, they told us that they would not give a bipolar diagnosis for a child under 18. These days, I see children diagnosed with bipolar disorder at 5 and 6 years old.
A 2-year-old can be throwing a temper tantrum and then stop and be fine. Anybody that's a parent has seen that happen. That doesn't mean they're mentally ill. It means they're 2-year-olds.